Greetings, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on diversion programs in the African context. We're just letting people into the room at the moment and be with you in a few more moments. Bear with us. As we're all settling in, let me just briefly run through some quick housekeeping issues for Zoom. Most of us are probably quite familiar with Zoom after the past year or so. But for those of us who are not, you can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little microphone and a little video camera. That's so you can mute your sound and turn your video camera on and off. And also, you can see the list of other participants at the bottom of the screen. And you'll notice there's a thing called the chat function. And what we're going to do during the Q&A, we'll actually ask you to share any questions or comments that you might have for the panelists using the chat function, and you can do that at any time. We'll keep a note if you hear one of the presenters and you think of a question, please just kind of pop a question into the chat, and we'll keep a note of that and come back to them at the end. Okay, well, I think everybody's more or less taken their seats now, so I'd like to just hand over to Professor Nick Crofts from GLEFA to do a brief introduction. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everybody. My name is Nick Crofts. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association. We're a relatively young organisation, but one that is growing immensely rapidly because of the increasing recognition that complex social issues cannot be responded to by one sector of society or another. We require partnerships to address them. Most often those partnerships, those responses to complex issues which have been based on a law enforcement response are moving away from a law enforcement response to a public health approach, and we're very much part of addressing and endorsing that move. Part of what we're doing is trying to build networks globally and regionally, and this webinar is one in a series working with colleagues in Africa, looking at complex issues that require innovative approaches, innovative public health approaches, as opposed to policing response and criminalisation responses. Our program today is on diversion programs in Africa and the utility and applicability of diversion programs in Africa. And we have a range of speakers experienced in diversion and diversion in the African context. But I'd like to hand over now to our moderator for today, Baz Dreisinger, who's the founder and executive director of Incarcerated Nations Network, and is at John Jay College in New York. Thanks, Baz.
Thank you, Nick. Greetings, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association and to LEAD for partnering on this critical webinar. As Nick mentioned, I represent the Incarceration Nations Network, a global network of justice reimaginers and prison reformers. And I think all of our worldwide partners, from Kenya to Brazil to Cambodia, agree that what we are going to talk about today, diversion from the criminal legal system, is what justice should really be grounded in. In other words, the main event in justice, so to speak, ought not be punishment and prisons, which make us less safe as a community, but other means of addressing things like mental health issues, substance abuse issues, and the various crimes of poverty. And what that other means is exactly what we're going to talk about today in an African context. And we have an incredible panel of diverse experts from across the continent to speak in a very practical, tangible way about diversionary approaches in their respective contexts. So to that end, we can jump right in, and I'll introduce our first very esteemed speaker, Justice Zone Ntaba, who is a judge in the High Court in Malawi and very active in human rights and gender issues. She is actively involved as a member of the Women Judges Association of Malawi, focusing on providing legal advice to women and children, holding legal clinics and offering mentorship programs. Very passionate, obviously, about development issues as well as women and child rights issues. Justice Ntaba, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Baz. I guess I'm moving right along, so let me just get the ball rolling. When we talk about justice, I think it's good to put into context the fact that although we always say justice is blind, and should not consider all sorts of issues, but we realize that justice is always going to be contextual, and more so in the African context, especially when you look at the concept of circumstances, well, the people involved, the time of the crime, the area that the crime has been committed, the culture in which it has been committed, and the gravity. And when I say that, you look at the context of, let's talk about circumstances or the area or the culture. A crime of theft of a bicycle in a village is so grave because that would be their only mode of transport. They would have saved so much money to have gotten there, compared to a theft of a bicycle in town for a child who lives in a suburban area. And so when you're considering diversion, those are things those are contexts that you have to look at. And those are the things that when you look at the African context, when diversion is being considered, they're like, okay, you have to think of where the crime is committed, who it has been committed against, what has been stolen, and the context of that particular crime. And so, although primarily in Malawi, diversion has been mostly used with children, we've also been made to understand, and we've seen it throughout the process, that diversion needs to be inculcated into criminal justice responders and players. And that is critical because we understand and have seen that most of us as criminal justice players, we don't have the necessary knowledge and resources to undertake diversion to the extent that is necessary. As such, we have to rely on strategic partners that are outside mostly the government system to work on diversion issues. And we also have to do that in a context where there are dwindling resources, there's increased criminality, especially in terms of violence and evolving crimes. Look at cybercrime nowadays, it's just gone over the top in terms of how it's been committed. But we also have to realize that diversion is critical, especially with overcrowding in our prisons. And now when you look at it from the point of view of the emergency issues that have been happening, like the COVID, and in Malawi, we'll continue to have natural disasters of flooding and all those things. Crime doesn't stop, it always continues. And so for us in Malawi, our diversion issues are found in our laws. For instance, we'll have something in the Local Courts Act. It has something that talks about community service, peace and good behavior orders. Our criminal procedure and evidence code has the same thing for children where they can be diverted upon arrest, release orders by a person who has not committed a serious crime and where they're diverted immediately, or a discharge if you think about it from another section, that is, I think, section 337. But I think the biggest concept for us is that diversion is mostly better, should I say, explained or provided for in the Child Care and Justice Protection Act. And the rest is left to judicial discretion, which in itself brings in problems. But what we've done as a country is that we've decided to work with strategic partners. So we've had to recognize our civil society members. For instance, PASI's Paralegal Advisory Services, who work in prisons and police cells. Same thing with CREA. And those are the ones that will flag out issues for us in terms of from the police to divert at the police station, and in prisons for us as judiciary to divert from there. My Wasintika Irish Rule of Law, and I think Bionic, they work with children and young persons, and those are constantly working with the judiciary in order to undertake diversions for children and young persons. But we also are lucky that we have what we call a Child Case Review Board under Section 150 of the Child Care and Justice Protection and Justice Act, which includes a judge and a magistrate who are allowed to do revisions with the cases of children that are incarcerated, in reformatory centers, or have found themselves in conflict with the law. But as the judiciary, I think the biggest concept for us is our biggest program works through what we call our confirmation and our review process. For any offense that is over 2 years, and for any fine that is, I think, above 100. But now we've changed it, that we're now confirming and reviewing all cases that come into the system from the magistrate's court. It doesn't matter how small the fine is or how little the sentence is. And that has predominantly seen that we are able to review and divert people, although they're already in the system. But we also undertake a lot of prison inspectorates as judicial officers, where we go and visit a prison or a reformatory school on our own without anybody intervening or asking us to do so. And that's also a process for us to divert. But we also do a lot of what we call prison camp courts, which means you go and sit in prison with your files with the offender, and you review their files and see whether they still need to be in that prison or they could be diverted at that point. But I think during COVID, the need for diversion became very critical, because we noted that there was a lot of children that were still in the system, and there were a lot of sick prisoners. Now with COVID, we needed to ensure that they were diverted out of the system. And as such, we had to take targeted prison camps to deal with those. A lot of prison inspectorates had to also happen immediately without not following the review time frame. But also police had to divert early at the onset of a pandemic for petty offenses. So when I look at the concept of diversion, and my thoughts on it are that although predominantly and most times diversion is reserved for a person who not to go through the formal court systems or to go to prison, Malawi has noted that diversion has even happened when a person is already in the system, in terms of that they've already gone into prison and are serving. But at confirmation sessions, we kind of divert them, and especially young persons and children from either reformatory schools themselves and for young persons from the prisons themselves. And we also noted that diversion is not always welcome in communities, especially for adults as compared to children. And those are things that we're all having to grapple with, despite the fact that diversion is an inculcated principle for the criminal justice system. And for children, there's a lot of supporting documentation for them when they're being diverted, which is not always the case for adults. And that need for those assessments has become a critical issue for us, because Malawi of recent times has had to deal with a lot of mob justice. And it's because people have committed crimes or they're back in the system, they've been bailed out or diverted out, and people don't understand the concept of how they're back from prison without having served their full time. But we're struggling with the lack of resources for diversion. So the personnel are not available in the courts. Our finances don't always have the ability to do the diversion itself or to actually get assessments done, or the equipment, and for court monitoring of the people that you've diverted. And so the treatment of diversion for persons that have reoffended after the diversion is still murky as well, and it's things that need to be considered. And those are thoughts that, when you look at diversion in the African context, are things that we still need to consider and have ideologies and principles around. But the biggest thing, and I think this is something that, since I started working in the criminal justice system, both as a prosecutor and as a judge, is that we've not been able to evaluate the impact of diversion in terms of crime prevention itself. And I look at it in terms of impact on the individual who has been diverted, society, or the victim as a whole. And I think it's critical that as Malawi, we do that, because then it gives us the point of view to understand how much we can divert, when we need to divert, and in what offenses and areas we need to continue the diversion to happen. So it is those issues, I think, that as a criminal justice player, I know diversion is critical for children. And I know diversion is critical for petty offenses, for instance. And I also know diversion will be useful for cases like vagrancy cases, which are a lot if you live in cities. And those are things that we need to consider and always have to have at the back of our mind when we are looking at creating diversion programs for ourselves, but also advocating for them in terms of programming as well as interventions for the judiciary or criminal justice players as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Ntaba. That was incredibly powerful, and I know there'll be many questions and much interest. we turn to South Africa, to Martin Schoentijk, who is a senior legal officer in the Open Society Justice Initiative's Criminal Justice Reform Program, embedded within the National Prosecutor's Office in Pretoria, South Africa. And I understand Martin is coming to us via video, as he could not be with us in the physical.
Hello, my name is Martin Schoentijk. I'm a senior advisor to the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa, and in particular involved in setting up an innovation and policy support office at the South African Prosecution Service. And I've been asked to speak today a bit about the evolution and the utility of diversion in the context of South Africa. So my focus will be on South Africa, on the prosecution service and how it uses diversionary mechanisms in various ways, which I will expand upon in a moment. Just to give a bit of background, South Africa is a constitutional democracy with approximately 60 million inhabitants, but with very high levels of serious violent crime. To give just one indication of that, the murder rate or the homicide rate as measured per 100,000 of the population is about 35. So for every 100,000 people who live in South Africa, there are every year approximately 35 murders. And that's very high, and not only by the standards of the region, of the continent of Africa, but certainly also internationally, with some exceptions in Central and Latin America. As a result of that, even though the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa, the NPA, has approximately 3,000 lawyers or prosecutors at its disposal, it's arguably very much understaffed. There simply are not enough prosecutors to deal with serious violent crime in particular. So the per capita number of prosecutors per murders or per armed robberies or sexual assaults is relatively low by international standards. This is aggravated in many ways by the fact that the investigations by the police, and the police is a separate department to the NPA, to the prosecution service, is aggravated by the fact that investigations by the police are relatively poor on the whole. So that one is dealing in South Africa with a classical criminal justice funnel, where a lot of crimes are committed, but very few of those crimes result in a prosecution or in a conviction. So just to give you some figures, of the approximately 3 million serious crimes which are recorded and reported in South Africa annually, less than 5% of those result in a conviction, and less than 1% result in a custodial sentence. In other words, a conviction of persons who've been convicted of serious crimes, especially serious violent crimes. Of course, it's in a way then stands to reason of what the dilemma the NPA or the prosecution service in South Africa faces. It's burdened by the massive influx of crime, investigations which it then has to prosecute and secure convictions, but it doesn't have sufficient number of lawyers to do so. So to be more effective, it's in many ways crucial for the NPA to make sure that minor offenses do not clog up the courts, that those are diverted in one way or another. That would be the one important point to make. And secondly, that the interventions that the NPA brings about or engages in do not have in themselves a criminogenic effect. In other words, that they worsen crime or the drivers of crime in South Africa. What has happened in South Africa in the past is that there's been a very liberal use of not only imprisonment, but also pretrial detention. Even now, approximately 1 out of every 3 prisoners in South Africa are awaiting trial or the finalization of their trial. And obviously, especially if one pushes a lot of young people into the prison system, into the pretrial detention system, they interact and engage very often with hardened criminals and come out of that system often much worse criminals than what they entered that system in the first place. So given that background, I think it's encouraging to note that South Africa has been experimenting with diversion in a variety of ways, probably over the last 10 to 15 years. Already in 2008, some 12 years ago, Parliament in South Africa promulgated a Child Justice Act, which formalizes diversion for juvenile offenders, for those under the age of 18. There's a very formal process prosecutors can go through, and this is then approved by the courts to divert youngsters and young people outside or away from the criminal justice process. It's used very effectively. In fact, very few juveniles end up in South Africa's prison system. But the numbers are relatively small in relation to the overall crime problem in South Africa. There are a relatively small number of juveniles who are diverted away from the criminal justice process or are involved in the criminal justice process in the first place. So the real intervention really at the moment for the NPA is around adult diversion. And the challenge there is that there's no legislative framework at the moment for adult diversion at all in South Africa. And the way the NPA has responded to that, it's developed a set of internal policy directives for prosecutors to try and provide some guidance to its prosecutorial staff as to how to deal with adult diversion. They call it both diversion. That's one option that prosecutors have available to them. Another one is informal mediation. And both of them fall under the umbrella term in a South African context of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, or ADRMs. In terms of the policy directives, which I just alluded to, prosecutors are encouraged to use diversion or ADRMs in respect of persons who've been charged with relatively minor crimes. And that has generally been the case over the last few years. Assault is a very typical crime for which diversion is used. Damage to property, relatively minor instances of theft. Possession of drugs would be another classical kind of crime where diversion would be used by prosecutors as well. And on the whole, one must say it's been quite a successful intervention, notwithstanding the lack of legislation for diversion of adult offenders in South Africa. So the latest figures which are available to us from last year, there were approximately 150,000 cases which were diverted and which involved adult offenders. So it's a significant number, which obviously reduces the pressure on the courts and on the prosecution services. And on its face, at least, one would expect would result in a favorable outcome, not only for the offenders, but also for the victims and their families, because the whole idea behind ADRMs in South Africa is that it should be a consultative process by which prosecutors consulted with victims and their families to take their views and their concerns into account before they offer a diversionary alternative to the victims in question. However, having said that, notwithstanding those successes, I think there are some criticism to be made in terms of the diversion process in South Africa. One is a lack of national uniformity, because it's only a policy directive which guides the approach. There's no legislation. There are still a number of prosecutors which divert offenders who have been charged with relatively serious offenses, such as domestic violence or aggravated assault. Which generally is discouraged by the policy directives because victims should, in principle, be somewhat skeptical not to have their day in court, as it were. The other problem with the diversion mechanism in South Africa is that the diversions themselves and the outcomes are not captured in a central database. So that there's a problem where one is dealing with repeat offenders who might appear in different courts and who are diverted again and again. The NPA, the prosecution service, has no way of uncovering that pattern in respect of such offenders, because an argument would then be made by victims groups, by the public, that where persons abuse the diversionary mechanism, as it were, by offending again and again, at the end of the day, prosecutors should probably take a harder approach and consider instituting a prosecution rather than always diverting such repeat offenders. A third challenge, and I think that's not unique to South Africa, but one sees that in many lower and middle income countries, is that it's quite easy for there to be a perception of corruption, even though that might be an unfair perception, that where prosecutors divert offenders away from the criminal justice system, that there's a perception that those prosecutors have been given a financial incentive or have been bribed in one way or another by the offender or his or her family. And this very often results in a lack of trust and undermines the public perception of the NPA, of the prosecution service in South Africa. But it has also resulted in a number of cases of vigilantism in South Africa, where people have been diverted, and the community sees this as an outcome of corrupt practices by the NPA, and have then taken the law into their own hands, where they've attacked, assaulted, and in some cases even murdered those offenders who've been diverted because they believe the formal criminal justice system wasn't sufficiently harsh or effective in dealing with such offenders. So these are the challenges which South Africa is grappling with, and I think this is not unique to South Africa. As I said, it's probably quite common in many other middle-income countries as well. Having said all this, and to conclude, I think it's important to point out that there's, in a South African context, and probably in an African context, tremendous potential for diversion, especially where one can augment diversionary mechanisms and policies with traditional justice mechanisms and traditional courts, where offences which are dealt at the village level or within a traditional justice mechanism, that those can use some of the more formal diversionary mechanisms to try and be more effective in relation to persons who've been charged with relatively minor offences. It does require, though, and this is often a challenge in poorer countries, a fairly robust network of civil society and community-based organizations who can provide many of the services which are necessary if diversion is to be successful, and to make sure that those who are diverted get sufficient support and services so that they are at minimal risk of reoffending or becoming in conflict with the law again. So this really, in a nutshell, is the picture in South Africa. It's a relatively recent development of the last 15 years. It's been relatively successful so far, with a number of challenges which I've pointed out. But policymakers are aware of these, and there are a lot of discussions to try and legislate to create a more formal framework to make the diversionary policies in South Africa more consistent and more uniform throughout the country. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for that. I think hearing that statistic of 150,000 adults diverted is quite a rich statistic to learn about, and I know there'll be interest and questions. I want to encourage our participants today to ask questions, comments. We'll have time for discussion afterwards, and we look forward to a robust conversation. Also really interesting to hear of this commonality in terms of Justice Ntaba and Martin Schoenteich both talking about lack of documentation and evaluation for this process as one of the challenges. We turn to Sabrina Matani, who is the co-founder of Advocate and is a British Zambian lawyer specializing in criminal justice and women's rights. She has authored the toolkit on gender-responsive non-custodial measures for the UNODC since 2019, also leading the Elders' New Access to Justice program. Sabrina will speak in a personal capacity. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Faz. Greetings to everyone here from Lusaka in Zambia. It's a real privilege to be here and to be speaking on a topic that I'm very passionate about. I've been working on issues to do with women in contact with the law for the past 15 years, globally, but mostly on the continent. And women in contact with the law have different pathways to prison than men and have different needs than men. So globally, we see a considerable proportion of women are in prison as a direct or indirect result of multiple layers of discrimination and deprivation. Women mainly commit crimes closely linked to poverty, and only a small minority of women are convicted for violent offences, and a large majority of them have been victims of violence themselves. But criminal legal systems were built by men, for men, and they often overlook the specific needs of women and girls. So globally, women make up between 2 to 9% of the global prison population. And this year is the 10-year anniversary of the Bangkok Rules, the first international standards that acknowledge the specific needs of women in contact with the law. And the Bangkok Rules acknowledge that prison is harmful for women and their families and give guidance on gender-responsive alternatives to imprisonment. So rules 57 and 58 provide that states should implement diversionary measures that do take into account the history of victimization that many women have experienced, as well as their caretaking responsibilities. So turning to Sierra Leone, and thank you for putting this slide up already. As Baz mentioned, 14 years ago, I helped to co-found Advocate, which is an organization that provides access to justice services and support services to women in contact with the law in Sierra Leone. And in 2019, Advocate and the Vance Center conducted research where we interviewed 86% of women in prison across Sierra Leone. And we found that these key pathways very much match the global pathways. We found that, the key pathways were poverty and discriminatory laws. As you see from this slide, 34% of women had been arrested and detained for survival, economic, or petty offenses. And if we can move to the next slide, we also see that gender-based violence is another key pathway for women to enter the criminal justice system. 48% of women we interviewed had experienced physical or sexual abuse as a child. And 72% of women told us that prior to prison, they had suffered at least one type of abuse from their partner or spouse. If we can move on to the next slide, we see that mental health is also another key pathway to imprisonment. 40% of the women surveyed had said they suffered anxiety before their imprisonment, but this is rarely taken into account by law enforcement officers or even judges. Next slide, please. And so this leads us, as we heard from in South Africa, sorry, the one before. This, one slide is missing, but it doesn't matter. I will tell you what the slide was supposed to say. So we found that 62% of women are in pretrial detention. And this is especially concerning, as Justice Ntaba mentioned, in Malawi with COVID. And we know that COVID spreads in overcrowded facilities. And so all of this really highlights the importance and, I would say, urgency of diverting women away from the criminal legal system and responding instead to the root issues which are relating to them coming into contact with the law. So Sierra Leone does have a policy in place for diversion for juveniles. It's not a law, but it was a policy that was developed 2 years ago. But due to lack of state services, they are often referred to NGOs, such as Defence for Children, who will provide mediation to settle the case or will provide support for alternatives to detention, such as bail or helping a child to not be in a police cell, but instead stay in a care home. But there is no formal policy for diversion for women. And so this has become a key part of Advocate's work, and our paralegals regularly monitor police stations and provide legal advice and support at an early stage, helping to divert cases. And this is really based on a trusted relationship that we have built up with the police over the last 14 years through trainings, through dialogue, where the police now can see that actually keeping a woman detained has an extremely harmful impact on her and her family and is far more costly to the state. So they will often refer cases to us, such as minor offences, debt cases, or mental health cases. And I'll give you a few examples. Recently, a woman was referred to Advocate by the police who was arrested for using threatening language and causing criminal damage, but they suspected that she might be suffering from mental health issues. So we were able, or our paralegals were able, to negotiate compensation for the victim and to provide the woman with mental health support and counselling, and to remove her from the justice system entirely. In another case, a 34-year-old woman who runs a small business selling fish had got a loan from a moneylender in February of this year. This was around $150, but due to COVID, her business collapsed. The moneylender reported her to the police, and she was detained for 3 days. But Advocate was able to help her to secure bail, organize a repayment plan with the moneylender, and also give her a small grant to help to restart her business. The challenge is, however, as in South Africa and Malawi, is that this is all informal. And we're advocating for a revision of the current Criminal Procedure Act, which will help to codify not only diversion, but wider alternatives to imprisonment. Sierra Leone does not have diversion mechanisms in place for drug use or drug possession. There are no specialized drug courts and no community drug treatment centers. Fortunately, drug offences are not very high in Sierra Leone, and this is the same in many West African countries, but it's certainly a gap, and it's something that needs to be developed, particularly as we look at other regions and we see that drug use and drug offending and the war on drugs is really a key driver of many people coming into prison in the first place. If we could please turn to the next slide. So I'm just going to draw to an end by making some kind of recommendations. The first is the need to develop gender responsive diversion policies. We can't think that whatever we put in place is going to be acceptable for everyone. We need to take into account the particular needs of women. So this includes, for example, making sure there's informed consent, that a woman completely understands what she is accepting to be diverted to. That we need to look at the risks women might face, such as gender-based violence in any program they're diverted to, or just generally the context that they're in. We need to take into account caretaking responsibilities. And we need to make sure we always use the minimum intervention necessary. So if a case should be dismissed outright, it should be dismissed rather than diverted. Secondly, we need to develop laws on gender-specific alternatives to incarceration. And I think that's been highlighted as very urgent here from the many countries we've spoken about. And this needs to be done in a holistic way. So not only looking at diversion, but looking at alternatives throughout the whole criminal legal process. And ultimately remembering that at the heart of it, we should be tackling the root causes that cause people to come into contact with the law in the first place. Thirdly, there's a very important need to decriminalize discriminatory laws. If these laws were decriminalized, then people wouldn't come into contact with the law in the first place. And this is particularly so for women who are really a victim of many discriminatory laws on the continent, which are colonial era laws that no longer serve us. It's also important to have increased funding for NGOs. As we've heard today, it's mostly NGOs and community organizations that are providing these services. But as I also work globally on access to justice, I know how hard it is to get funding for access to justice services. Funding for access to justice has declined by 40% over the last 4 years. So it's really crucial that we are getting more resources to these organizations and making sure that donors don't just focus on government-supported and led programs. It's vital that we share best practices, and we absolutely need more best practices from the continent. So that's why this webinar is a great start. And I would like to see more opportunities where people from the continent, practitioners from the continent, and people with lived experience can come together to discuss strategies and ideas. And lastly, it's really important to undertake research on the impact of gender responsive diversion. We need more evidence about what is happening, where are the gaps, and evidence to show governments that diversion is useful. It creates less harm for society and the community, and also less cost to the state. Next slide, please. As Baz mentioned, I developed a toolkit on gender-responsive non-custodial measures for UNODC, and I hope it might be a useful resource for many of you here on this webinar. And it contains some useful comparative examples, which I'll briefly mention just two. In Costa Rica, women are diverted away from the criminal legal system and offered tailored counseling, drug treatment, and job training, and that was seen to be a very effective program. Similarly, in the UK, there was a program where women were diverted to women's centres. And the Ministry of Justice found that the reoffending rate for these women, they looked at 597, was 30% compared with 35% from a group of similar women who did not receive such support. So again, I do think we need more research on the continent so we can show that diversion does work and is useful. And the final slide, please. The final slide here is just a thank you to all of you on the webinar. Please, there's my email address. Please do reach out if you've got questions, want to collaborate. And also a massive thanks to everybody who did kind of provide support to either the slides here or the research. And of course, ultimately to the Advocate team. I always say that I am their ambassador, speaking about the good work they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. And I just wanted to say, I think there were some comments being made about, is the recording going to be sent out afterward? Indeed, it will be. And in addition, I would think that we can also send a link to Sabrina's toolkit just mentioned. I appreciate your call for more webinars like this that bring us together, and especially the elevating of those voices of those directly impacted to shape policy around diversion on the continent and beyond. So thank you for that. Please, audience, keep the questions coming. We've got a number of very interesting ones that I know our panelists will be eager to dive into. We turn to our last speaker, Brendan Cox, who is the former chief of police in the U.S., now national coordinator of law enforcement assisted diversion. He is based in the U.S. but looking globally, so that means possible collaborations ahead. Brendan is co-convener of the Deflection and Diversion Special Interest Group of the Global LEPH Association. Welcome, Brendan.
Thanks, Baz. It's great to be here today, and I appreciate the just a great panel, and it's great to be here today. I don't know how I'm batting cleanup after those great speakers that were before me, but it's just wonderful to be on this panel. I'm going to talk about law enforcement assisted diversion and what we do, but I want to talk about how we can learn from each other and some of the things that I've learned, specifically to a trip that we took back in February, which seems like forever ago, based on the pandemic. But back in February, a group of myself and a group of my colleagues from Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion were lucky enough to come to South Africa and go to Cape Town, Durban, and Pretoria to look at how law enforcement assisted diversion might be able to be implemented in those cities, and how we could bring pre-arrest diversion to South Africa, and how that would look in terms of what was happening in South Africa, and how we could ultimately learn from each other. And I think one of the things that I've seen over the past almost 4 years that I've been with the lead National Support Bureau is the recognition that globally we all face many of the same challenges. And I think we face many of those same challenges because we have over-relied on, and I apologize because a lot because of what the United States has pushed when it comes to the war on drugs, but we have overutilized punishment and prison and coercion to try to end substance use and try to deal with mental illness. And certainly now that the issues around homelessness and poverty, we've tried to address those issues through the criminal legal system. And I certainly think that from the panelists, what everybody's spoken about, and certainly this audience has realized is that we can't do that. That's not the way to handle those issues. And certainly the backlash in the United States, and from my previous job as a chief of a smaller, medium-sized city in upstate New York, 100,000 people, 24 square miles, but very much engaged in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s in the war on drugs, and believing we can just arrest everybody and somehow solve our problems of really traumatic situations for many people, especially people of color. That we created actually a lot of damage and a lot of trauma, and ultimately created a bad situation between policing and our community. And instead of looking at things in a public health light, we tried to use the criminal justice system to solve those issues. So in LEAD, ultimately what LEAD's trying to do is it's taking, in fact, many of folks that we've already sent through the cycle of the criminal legal system many times over and over again, who suffer from unmet behavioral health needs, whether it's substance use, mental illness, or many, many times those two co-occurring issues, or are living in poverty or homeless, and recognizing that the criminal legal system, and as far as I can tell anywhere in this world, aren't set up to deal with those issues, taking them out of that, and rather than arresting them before we file charges, just completely removing them. And instead of making that arrest, calling a case manager, and at the point of crime, having a police officer call that case manager, meet that case manager, and do a quick warm handoff, where that warm handoff is, me as the police officer saying to that case manager, here's Brendan Cox, and tonight he committed a crime, whether that be possession of drugs, which maybe someday, hopefully, all of our countries will recognize that shouldn't be a crime, or stealing from a store to support an addiction, or because I'm homeless or living in poverty and I can't pay for that item. And rather than arresting, say, I want you to start working with them and we're going to go from there. And rather than making that arrest. And in LEAD, there's ultimately 3 ways to get in. There can be that point of arrest, point of crime, where the officer can make that referral. There's the fact that officers can make those referrals prior to that person committing a new crime. So many officers, not just in the United States, but certainly what I saw in South Africa in all 3 cities, were police officers that knew their community and knew individuals that were engaged in criminal activity, and knew people that needed help. And certainly police officers in LEAD can refer folks into that case management before they're committing a new crime. Or one of the newest things that we're doing in LEAD is actually having community members be able to make those referrals in. So LEAD enables officers and community members to be able to get somebody engaged in harm reduction-based services, which I'll touch on in a minute. But as I saw in South Africa, was the exact thing of the things that we're trying to address in the United States, and that LEAD is trying to address. And LEAD, in starting in Seattle, Washington in 2011, it started because of racial disparities within the war on drugs and drug arrests, and we've seen it expand across the United States based on that. But very specifically, what I saw in South Africa and what our hosts were able to show us in the 3 cities were the exact things that we're dealing with in the United States, maybe in a different setting, but folks with substance use disorders, folks with mental illness, folks living in poverty and homeless, and the police being on the front line of trying to address those and not having the resources to do that. And because the criminal legal system was ultimately the avenue of trying to address those, some really negative outcomes because of that. Things that I witnessed in my 23-year career in law enforcement, those negative outcomes between police and community, and poor relationships, and traumatic issues going on between police and community. And not only the community and people with lived experience and people that were people that had substance use disorders, or folks that were homeless or living in poverty, having negative interactions, but police recognizing that there needed to be a paradigm shift and that things weren't working. And we met a lot of really good police officers and police leaders that recognized that this was not working, and that having police on the front lines of dealing with behavioral health issues, dealing with homelessness, and dealing with poverty is not working. And I know in the chat, a few folks had put in, well, what do we do? So how do we deal with this? And what do we do with folks? We're talking about diversion, and the speakers before me all talked about, like, we're going to try to remove folks from the system at different places. And in LEAD, we're trying to do that up front. We're trying to do that at the point of contact. So what do we do in LEAD? How do we do this when we have an officer say, I'm not going to arrest somebody, I'm going to offer them help? And what does help mean? So in LEAD, help means that I'm going to, instead of making that arrest, instead of bringing that person back into the system, I'm going to get a case manager and I'm going to have them start working with the individual. And working with the individual means they're going to build a relationship with that person. And they're going to work with them from a harm reduction-based philosophy. And that harm reduction-based philosophy means that they're going to work with them in a very non-judgmental, person-centered way. And they're going to start figuring out what it is that they can do to reduce the risks of the behavior that individual's involved in, and that they're going to recognize that not everybody's ready, willing, or able to make big changes, but that if they can make incremental changes, that they can have better, long-lasting changes over a long period of time and ultimately have a better outcome. But also recognize that, the U.S. is the richest country in the world, yet we haven't solved getting people services. We have not solved being able to get people access to treatment on demand. We have not been able to solve medical assisted treatment, although it should be easy to do. We still don't do things like have safe consumption sites, so we can make sure that folks that have serious addiction to an opiate can use safely and not die and not overdose. We continue to have high overdose rates. But in places where services are really lacking, case managers can start working to build those relationships to find many times small incremental things that can help that person get connected to what little services there are, can start building that relationship for when somebody is able to make changes, and start building that trusting relationship so when somebody is ready to do things, they have somebody that can help them do that. And I know that might sound really little, and that might sound something like, well, okay, so we have somebody that's getting somebody ready. But if we think about the stages of change, and if we think about many times the folks we're dealing with, and many times the folks that have the most needs, they don't trust folks. They've been through much trauma in their lives. They're living out on the street. They don't trust the system. They've been through the system over and over again. And until we build a relationship with them and we have them recognize that the person that's working with them is not judging them, is not stigmatizing them, and can be there to help them out, they're not going to seek that help out, and they're not going to trust the individual that they're with. What we see in LEAD is that many times when people take that offer for help, they're very skeptical about it. They're still waiting for the regular system to kick in. They're still waiting to be told that they're on probation or they're on some kind of surveillance. And it's only after a while, until they meet with their case manager, that they realize that this is something different. And that harm reduction is truly accepting of where they're at in life. And you'll hear many people talk about harm reduction, about meeting people where they're at and working with them where they are. And that's figuratively and literally. But it's about not leaving them there. It's about figuring out, and our case managers through civil society, through NGOs, really do an amazing job of working with people in a way of, especially through motivational interviewing and realizing the trauma people have been through, of starting to find the small wins that they can get with an individual to be able to gain their trust and to be able to start figuring out what's underneath. Because I think Sabrina just said a few minutes ago, until we find out what the root cause of some of the issues are, we can't really solve the issues. And, Martin was talking about the violence in South Africa, as a former police chief, chief of police, there, maybe I can talk now. As a former chief of police, my job ultimately was to keep the public safe. And public health issues, certainly they fall under public safety. But public safety is everyone's responsibility, not just the chief of police, not just law enforcement. And at the end of the day, I'd rather have the public health folks dealing with public health issues. So if I could take substance use issues, if I could take mental health issues, if I could take homelessness and poverty off of the plate of law enforcement and have other folks dealing with that, then when it came to shootings and stabbings and domestic violence and robberies and burglaries, and keep that on my police department's plate, then I could actually make my city safer, because I could have my officers dealing with what I needed them to deal with. The prosecutor's office could deal with more serious crimes, because if I was ultimately diverting folks at point of contact from the police officers and not making those arrests, then at the end of the day, those cases were never making it to the district attorney's office. And when we were turning around and not arresting somebody and having case conferences about how that person was doing, if there was old cases, as there many times were, because folks that we were ultimately diverting and are diverting have older cases. And, as an example, the first person we diverted in Albany had 44 previous arrests, 22 previous convictions. And one of those previous arrests, he was about to get sentenced to 9 months in our county jail, or in a county that was next to our county. And instead of putting him in jail, he was kept out and getting engaged in services. Then we can ultimately keep focused on more serious crimes. But at the end of the day, those are the kind of things we can do. And those, when we look at what we can learn from each other, we can make these things happen, not just in the United States. We can make these things happen on the continent of Africa. And certainly what we saw in South Africa is that we can make this happen. If it was not for the pandemic, we would have been back in October really trying to get this off the ground. We do need to make sure we do have things like formal policies in place. We do need to change our laws. That certainly helps because we need the policymakers to be able to say, we need to do this. So I'll end there with that. But at the end of the day, this not only helps the individual participants, this helps our police agencies, this helps our communities, and this makes for a safer public.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for that detailed and robust discussion of LEAD's work. And thank you also for pointing out something quite critical, which is the U.S.'s role in essentially pushing bereft criminal justice policy around the world, and the importance of webinars like this that highlight local solutions, culture-specific solutions, and how to have that conversation in a global context. I know at Incarceration Nations Network, we are all about elevating the work that is happening globally and not privileging the work that is happening in the United States, which has created, in so many respects, the global mess and the systems and structures that we exist in. I'm thrilled to turn to some questions that have been coming in. And I will start with both Mark Krupansky and Sean Verano asked similarly about diversion to what? Mark writes, there are a number of offenses, especially petty offenses, that many of us, including the African Court on Human and People's Rights, think should not be criminalized nor treated as a public safety issue. There are other acts that are seen as public safety threats, but can better be dealt with and prevented through something other than the criminal justice system. So in these latter circumstances, what are people being diverted to? How are these being invested in, supported, and assessed? And I think this is so critical, this question, lest we risk the wrong impression that diversion doesn't work, not because it doesn't work, but because it wasn't done well. So I will open that up. I know, Brendan, you just specifically laid out how LEAD approaches this and what diversion to what looks like. Maybe you want to jump in, but I'm sure our other panelists have something to say about this. Brendan, should we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we are diverting to that individual who's building that relationship and figuring out what it is that person needs. And then what we're trying to do after that, because we come from a collaborative approach, so not one individual agency owns LEAD. So we try to have a collaborative approach of both public safety, governmental agencies, civil rights agencies, and we try to identify the gaps and then get those agencies to start filling those gaps. So, housing is our number one issue. I'm not going to say we've solved housing, but we try to start recognizing that we need lower barrier housing where we don't keep people out of housing because they have previous convictions or because they're still utilizing drugs. So we were trying to get our partners to recognize that we have to lift those barriers. Same thing for employment. Same thing for even the little things, like we try to lift barriers to get people identification so we can get them back on services. We can get them the benefits they need. But it's really about trying to identify what those gaps are and then get folks to lift those barriers that are in the way of getting them the services. But it's certainly, by all means, we have not solved that divert to what issue. It's really on a community by community basis of trying to address what that need is and figure out how we get people what they need.
Sabrina, Justice Ntaba, unfortunately, Martin is not with us in the virtual, so he can't respond to that.
I guess diversion to what depends on the context. Now, if you look at the concept of somebody has stolen a chicken, in our African context, the restoration is that for them would be to, for instance, to go do public works for the community. And that is available, and that's even available under our law, that one of the sentences you can give out is public works. One of the sentences you can give out is community service. If you serve the community that you took from, it gives a sense of justice to that community. So it is those kind of principles, I think, when we say, sorry, I forgot to put my video on, diverting to what? It is also contextualized. And that's why I keep saying justice must be contextualized, because what people are seeking when a person has committed an offense is the concept of justice, but others, they look at restoration. And restoration, they might understand, if it was a crime of need, might not be restoration of the thing that was stolen, but it's restoration of the dignity, restoration of the fact that you took away from us, give it back in serving us. And all those things, I think, are issues we should consider when we look at diversion.
And would you say, with regard to a system of care, and maybe Sabrina, you want to address this as well in a gender context, is there a diversion to a system of care that supports and addresses sort of the root causes of what caused the crime in the first place?
And before Sabrina comes, can I give a context of a case that I recently dealt with? It was when this woman committed a crime, she was in what we call a market setting. She had gone to buy stuff for herself. She was pregnant. She didn't have enough money, so she stole. And whatever she stole, she was arrested immediately. The things were recovered. Somehow she was taken before, first and foremost, police, who still arrested her and still kept her in custody. She was taken a day or two later before magistrate, where she pleaded guilty and was arrested and was sentenced. This woman came to me for review under what we call a review process on propriety of the conviction and the sentence. She was literally about to go and give birth that same day. I reviewed the case, we released her. In the morning, the next day she had given birth. Now that is the context of when you think this was a suitable case of diversion. The police should have actually asked for better information regarding her pregnancy. They should have diverted immediately. They have powers to do that because the issues were recovered. And the woman who actually she stole from said didn't want her arrested. And those are all contexts that we must consider when we're diverting. Because sometimes even the people that you've committed crimes against don't actually want you to be arrested. As long as they recover their stuff, they're quite fine with that. So it is, as I keep saying, there are all these issues that the criminal justice system must look at. It's just not looking at the justice, but it must look at fairness, it must look at the compassion. And I always say now in the context of Africa, the Umuntu principle, the humanity aspect of it, that has to also be considered. Thank you.
Thank
Brilliant.
you. Justice Ntaba, I think you need to come to Sierra Leone and Zambia and do some workshops for our judges as well. But I mean, I definitely agree. I think that diversion has to look at the particular needs of that person. And so some of the examples I gave from our work in Sierra Leone, we really try to respond to what the issue is. So whether it's providing some sort of mental health support, if that's an issue, or if it's working out a repayment plan for the woman, if it's a debt issue. And also, in the example I gave, we're not always able, but we're able to give a grant to help that woman to start her business back again, because otherwise maybe she would have found herself back in the criminal legal system, because effectively in many countries on the continent, it's poverty that's being criminalized. And I do think that, supporting diversion does not mean we're not supporting decriminalization. So advocate myself, I'm a strong advocate for decriminalizing petty offenses. I'm tired of seeing women being arrested for owing money. This is not something that should be happening. It should not something that should be happening in 2020. And I see too many of these cases. So we do need to fight for decriminalization. But I think in the meantime, diversion is a much better option. And we need to make sure it's focused on the individual. A blanket kind of system of diversion is not going to help anyone.
So on that note, there are two questions from Rebecca Schaefer, one specifically for you, Sabrina, and one for the panel. So Rebecca asks you, I'm wondering how the rates of abuse, mental illness, et cetera, for men involved with the system compare with those of women. It seems that many of the strong arguments for diverting women from the system apply also to men. I do take the point that the existing programs do not sufficiently reach women. So that's the question specifically for you. And then more broadly, which ties into your last point, how does diversion from minor offenses impact policing of these behaviors? And how does the diversion movement interact with the movement for decriminalization of petty offenses? I think you started talking about that just now, but perhaps you have some more thoughts.
Thanks. And hi, Rebecca, a longstanding friend and someone I respect very much on her own work, particularly in Latin America. Really good point, Rebecca. Of course, many of the same issues that we see lead women to come into contact with the law absolutely are the driving forces behind men, particularly poverty and mental health issues. I'm afraid I don't have that kind of research because my focus or my life has been dedicated to looking at women, because I feel that they're often overlooked. And particularly at Advocate, we never wanted the issues to do with women just to be tagged on to the end, which is what we often see. And so we wanted our whole work to be focused just on women and to design it that way. But I do think at the same time that whilst we're not saying that men are not deserving for diversion, I think we do need to make sure we're always having a gender lens, because all too often we just see the same policies being implemented without taking into account any kind of gender specific criteria. And it is certainly the case that we do find women being arrested for many more low risk offences. And it is, there is other kinds of impacts on children that don't happen with men. Traditionally, still, women play a really strong caregiving role in many African contexts. So there is this other kind of caretaking responsibility that, again, will not always factor in. And, the research that we have seen so far and that we've been involved in does find that prison has a particularly harmful impact on women. Again, I think prison is harmful for everyone. I've experienced it myself in my own family. My father was imprisoned. It had a huge impact on me as a child, and very much informs the work that I do today. So definitely prison is harmful for everyone. But we found that, women are much more susceptible to self-harm and depression and other kind of mental health issues once they are detained. So there are particular gender specific criteria, I think, or factors we do need to take into account. I think I've sort of answered it from my own perspective, the question around decrim and diversion. So I might throw that to some of the other panelists and see if they have anything to add. And also to hear from you, Rebecca, because you have so much insight in this area yourself.
Other thoughts from Brendan, Justice, and Taba on this question of how diversion impacts policing of these behaviors and how the diversion movement interacts with the movement for more systemic decriminalization of the petty offenses or the war on drugs, as the case may be?
So I think, just from coming from a police background, certainly as a former police chief, part of the reason why I wanted to implement a diversion program was to change the paradigm, to recognize that, like arresting people, it was not always the right answer. In fact, many times it was the wrong answer. And to really also to stop some of the judgment and gain back empathy. I have no problem admitting as part of my career I lost empathy for people, and that's not a good thing. We're supposed to be helping folks. We're supposed to understand what people are going through and make the right decisions, not the wrong decisions. And we have to recognize just because something's against the law doesn't mean that law is right, and it doesn't mean that just because something's written down does not mean that that action is the right action. There's a reason why we have discretion, but we also wind up being pawns, and at times we have to stop being pawns. I tell cops across the United States all the time, the war on drugs was not declared by somebody in law enforcement who said, hey, we've got a real danger here, and if we don't stop the flow of drugs and people using drugs in our country, we're gonna, things are gonna fall apart. It was declared by a politician, and ultimately we've been used as pawns for a long time. So we have to shift that paradigm. We have created trauma within our communities and targeted certain communities of color. We need to change that. We need to shift back, and we need to realize that the harm that we've committed has far outdone the harm of the drug itself. And if we don't change that, we're just committing the same sin over and over again. We continue to want to have people cooperate with us. We continue to want people to be able to tell us what's happening in our communities. We continue to want people to actually come forward and testify when violent crime happens. Yet we don't want to have an empathy and understanding for what people are going through. We don't want to get to the root cause of what the situation is, and we need to be able to do that.
And I suppose it's important to point out this idea that you can push to clean up the mess of policies while also pushing for systemic change at the same time, right? Justice Ntaba?
My response to the issue about whether the petty offenses will impact how we decriminalize, the fact still remains most of us are dealing from a criminal justice perspective, especially for the judiciary, we're dealing with both of them at the very end of the process, where they've already been put into the system. And so we are dealing with diversion from that perspective, that we still need to divert even though they're already in the system. So we are looking at both issues, and the decriminalization becomes still very much critical, because when you look at it, we have very, very interesting offenses on our books, statute books, and Zambia will confirm that, and I'm sure Nigeria and a few others that have a common law background will tell you. Rogue and vagabond, how we use the concept of rogue and vagabond, how we use the concept of idle and disorderly conduct. And those are still offenses that are still on our statute book that are putting a lot of people in the system. And so we are looking at diverting from the point of view of both those two areas, because we understand for others, they do need that diversion aspect, because if they're idly and disorderly because they have a substance abuse problem, they need to be diverted to a program that will assist them. But the others that are in the system because they are just poor, they are being a rogue and vagabond because they were either going against curfew issues, or they're in spaces where they were working, sex workers, for instance. And that in itself means there has to be a way that criminal justice players have to look at both those issues and look at the interlinkages, the interconnections, do the research, and understand that the fight has to be both-sided. Diversion is still critical and important for the criminal justice system, and decrim is still very important, especially for the offenses that are putting people in the system that should not be in the system. So for me I can't think of delinking them. The issue for me is to look at the interconnections and the interlinkages and find ways to ensure policy and legislation ensures that both do not violate people's rights, and also make sure that we protect and promote those people that usually will have been in the system because of a crime of need as opposed to a crime of want.
Thank you so much. There are two more questions that are on a very sort of practical nitty-gritty tip. So maybe I will put them together and our panelists can jump in. Any research, this is from Denise Tomasini Joshi, any research measuring something other than, quote, reoffending? So I know it was mentioned a couple of times that there's a lack of data altogether, but where there is data, where there is measurement, are we able to go beyond just the simple recidivism rates and reoffending rates? And from Carrie Hurst, is the overall cost of diversion programs expensive as compared to sentencing and prison? So anyone want to weigh in on evaluation and research methods and standards and or costs?
Thanks, Baz. I just add that when I was developing this gender responsive toolkit for UNODC, I found it incredibly difficult to find studies that had been done on a gender perspective around diversion. So I definitely think there's a lot more need for research and research that is much more participatory, that does involve the voices of people with lived experience themselves, so that we can be looking at other impacts, not just, these sort of recidivism rates and those sorts of numbers, which I don't always like myself. So I absolutely think there needs to be more investment, but not only more research, but we need to look at the way we're doing the research.
We've had some research done outside of just the reduction in recidivism. We have had a couple of cost evaluations done where it is cheaper. However, we actually would want to go the other way because we realize we should actually invest more in the folks that we're diverting. But then there's also been some on engagement and services showing a higher rate of engagement. And then what I like the best is the last research piece that was done with an interview of many of the participants, talking to them about why they stayed engaged in LEAD and what their views were, both of being involved in LEAD and then their views of law enforcement and how their views of policing changed by being engaged in LEAD. And I don't think you should have to go through a police officer to get help. I think that's one of the things we definitely need to finally get rid of. But at the same time, our participants said, I didn't like the police very much before LEAD came along, and sometimes very specifically, I didn't like that officer before this came along. But, now it was that officer that got me connected to this case manager and to this program, and I'm doing really well. So I now look at that officer much different. And we've had stories where we've had both the police officer and the individual in LEAD say, like, we have a totally different relationship now that this officer got that case manager involved, and now that they see each other in a different light. So I think that, to me, that's really impressive to have that happen, that relationship change.
My comment in terms of, should I say, what the data? I always say data is the most political, should I say, political thing that that countries, agencies use to actually work on either finding resources, which goes to the issues of the cost, but also in making sure they can advance their agenda. So when you look at the concept of why we continue to only evaluate reoffending as opposed to evaluating whether that person, when they went back into society, was able to move on and be a productive citizen, how much they've contributed to that society, or whether they've actually, them being back into the system, in the community, having been in the prison system, has also helped to actually educate others not to get into the system, because that's something you also want to see whether a person who's come out from a prison system, has been diverted, is also an advocate for why he should not commit crimes. And those are all things that we could get data on, but we don't. And it matters as to why do we want the data for reoffending? Is it for us to build more prisons? Is it for us to put more money into police? It depends on the issues. And those are the reasons why I think when we look at criminal justice reforms, we need to stop looking at criminal justice reforms from a point of view of just the criminality, but also look at it from an overall perspective of social needs, economic issues, and all that. And then maybe we could rethink the way we do data for diversion and petty crimes. And that's why I would say it's always difficult when you deal with programming. And this is not from a justice perspective, but programming from the perspective of how much money do you want to put into this criminal justice system for people that have reoffended. And that's where I would leave my comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Such a critical point. We are almost out of time, but I have two more questions. One specifically for Brendan. What is the professional background of LEAD case managers? And secondly, is there a place for people with lived experience in providing support via LEAD programs? And we have, and I think this is actually a perfect question for our panelists to kind of wrap up on, a question from Nonso Maduka in Nigeria, saying that for now, though there has been some activism on decriminalization of petty offenses in the Nigerian context, but in Nigeria, diversion is still far-fetched. So how do we go about it, beginning with resources to learn more about diversion, especially for nonviolent drug offenses? So could panelists make any recommendations for kind of next steps in a Nigerian context per this question, but also perhaps in a global context? Where can people go? What resources can they access? Are there any collaborative efforts happening already? So Brendan, I'll let you go first to take both of those and then let our other two panelists weigh in.
All right, great. So our case managers, they run the gamut. It's everything from peers, where they prior lived experience, to folks with double masters, folks with MSWs. Whenever we look at it, we certainly try to have it be a community-based organization that does the case management itself and has a harm reduction background. But really the folks that are out there on the street, actual as case managers, they run the gamut. We try to make sure that it's folks that really know how to build those trusting relationships. That's kind of the key. That's kind of the, and Tracy, we can, if you want some more information as part of your work, we can, my colleague, Nigel Morris, would be much better schooled answering that question than I am. As far as the second question, what I've found, I don't mean to cheap out on this, on the answer is, just getting a bunch of people in a room and just start talking through ideas and just start talking through, like, how can we make this happen? Like, where are we all coming from, and how do we start talking about where we either come from decrim, or how we get to start running some kind of pilot where we get people to stop making arrests and start getting people connected to services. I think getting some folks in a room, getting police in the room, getting prosecutors in the room, getting civil rights folks in the room, and just start having that conversation.
In terms of how do you get people to actually start putting resources into diversion, I would say my first point of call coming from the judiciary is I always look at what your judiciary is saying about some of the crimes, because you'll be surprised how much judges, magistrates put into judgments things that they think should be happening in the criminal justice system. And a lot of that they'll talk about the laws, they'll talk about the petty crimes, they'll talk about the fact that there's need for resources for people not to be in the system and not to be in prisons. And if you gather that information and gather the cost of the crime and the cost of what it means to keep people in prison, especially those that have committed petty crimes that would have been more productive in society, then you have your first point of call for dealing with criminal justice players and the ministries. And you talk about the Ministry of Finance, they like to hear people who are going to be productive and be paying taxes. And prisoners are not going to be paying taxes. They don't want to hear. And those are things that you must speak the language, because if you have too many people in prison that are not paying their taxes, it means the national budget is being affected. And all those things are necessary issues. I think we must package. It's about branding and packaging the information as well. It's all out there, but it's how you talk to the policymakers, and so that you're speaking their language for them to understand what the impact of putting too many people in prison is on the national budget, as well as what it is costing them as a country.
I'll just add that I totally agree around bringing people around the room. And I think, where we started was just discussions with prison officers around, how it was not helpful for them to have lots of people in detention, and it was, causing prisons to be overcrowded. And having these conversations helped, I think, for them to start kind of diverting cases to us. And, in Sierra Leone, diversion is not really called diversion, it's called referral. And actually, that's what it is. It's sort of, police referring cases to civil society groups who they think can support individuals. And I think that really needs relationships. And so that kind of conversation is extremely helpful. I'm very willing to share the diversion policy for juveniles on Sierra Leone or any other kinds of materials I have. So please, do feel free to drop me an email. And I also think, when it comes to, so the question was also related, obviously, to drug-related offences. I do think then it's really important to be engaging public health experts and any sort of community-based treatment, because we need to recognise our own limitations. And so this is where we might need to kind of refer to someone with some specialist kind of knowledge about how to best respond to that, but particularly to make sure that it is in the community, it's voluntary, referring people to compulsory drug treatment, which is effectively another kind of form of detention, is also not helpful. So that's really important.
Thank you. And speaking of referral, I would also refer our viewers to incarcerationnationsnetwork.com, to our platform, which showcases the work of our partners in a host of contexts, including LEAD, Advocate, both of whom we're proud to call INN partners. There are a number of strong diversion programs on there, restorative justice programs, and other alternative to incarceration programs on our platform. I'm a big fan of saying that we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, that there are lots of organizations out there globally doing really effective, strong work, and we can learn from them and collaborate with them and build together. So on that note, I want to personally thank our panelists for being part of this powerful webinar, and thanks to GLIFA for coordinating in collaboration with us and with LEAD, and I will pass it on to Nick to take us out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baz. And thank you to all the speakers too. I echo what Baz's thanks. don't particularly want to make a speech, but one of the things that's come out of this discussion for me is that perhaps we need to do a little bit of reframing, because the question that we're asking is diversion to what? And the question that keeps on coming through is, we've set up a system that systematically diverts people away from the services that they should be getting and diverts our attention away from the causes behind why people are in the situations they're in. So maybe we should be thinking about diversion from what, and what should people be getting, rather than than diverting away from what seems to be the accepted normal of criminalisation. And particularly in the context where we are increasingly knowing about the impact of adverse childhood experiences and of trauma on people's behaviour and situations. And trauma-informed policing and adverse childhood experience-informed policing is something that we will be tackling well, we do tackle, but we will be increasingly tackling in this context. Sabrina, amongst others, called for further work in this area. The Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association is looking to support development of regional law enforcement public health networks. These webinars are one aspect of that. We are building a mailing list for people interested in being part of a regional network, and anyone who wishes to be part of it, please get in touch and we'll add you to the mailing list. This is looking at building to regional meetings of a regional law enforcement and public health network to look at what we can do to further these issues in the regional context. More than anything else, we're trying to provide a venue for people to come together. As Baz said, there's plenty of people working in this area, and we're trying to, Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association is trying to provide a venue for people to come together. And I see Tracy has mentioned the special interest group. The Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association has a number of special interest groups, and there is one specifically on deflection and diversion programs that Brendan is a co-convener of and Tracy is a co-convener of. And that's one way of people being able to connect with what we continue to do in this area. Tim, could I have the slide, please? And lastly, I would like to mention the annual international conference of the Global Law Enforcement Public Health Association was to be held in Philadelphia next year, but because of the virus, it's going to be virtual. And these are all issues that we've been talking about that will feature prominently within that conference. Our conference, when it's face-to-face, is very much about networking and providing a safe space for people who are often in conflict day-to-day, health and justice sectors, people working in law enforcement and people working in health and welfare. And our conference has provided and continues to provide a safe space for people to get together across those sectors and across those sectoral boundaries. It's not so good with the virtual conference, but we will be back together face-to-face, I hope, in coming years. Having said that, anyone who wishes to follow up with me on any of these activities, Sabrina, Zioni, I will definitely be following up with you to talk about further joint activities that we can undertake in the region. And anyone else who's interested in being part of that growing regional network or the global network, please get in touch. Thank you very much to everyone who contributed to this very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alki, did you want to say something, or are you clapping?
I'm just clapping, Nick. Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.